the reigning world champions at the time we're speaking are South American. The team who've won this trophy more times than anyone else is South American. What they're saying through the World Cup is, we are winners, you are jealous of us. What the other nation, what they're saying, we exist. And I think it means more to South America than anywhere else.
Tim Vickery, we met a couple of weeks ago in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. We're here in London. We've got the World Cup trophy between us.
In very congenial circumstances, but somewhat colder.
Yeah, we've got Ronaldo, the man, next to us.
Yep.
So you've just written a book, which is amazingly your first.
Co-written
with
a fellow named Mark Birham.
Mark Birham. And what's it called? What's it about?
It's called Mundiales. It's a history of the World Cup from a South American point of view. And yeah, you said it's my first book. I never thought I'd do it. Too many words, my dear Wolfgang. But it's been done. It's been done, and it's out now, and I'm very proud of it. You know, I mean, I didn't really want to do one. I kind of love trees. You know?
Yeah.
And if
you can read on Kindle these days.
Yeah, true. But I can't.
Right.
I can't
okay.
read. You know, it's got to be
audiobooks.
Perhaps. So if trees were going to perish, I wanted it to be for a good cause, and I think the World Cup from a South American point of view is a good enough cause to justify the sacrifice of one or two trees.
So it all begins, as any childhood devourer of World Cup books will know, in Uruguay 1930.
Aha!
Or
You
did
say
it?
so, but we disagree. Really, it all begins in 1916.
Okay.
Where
When World War I's going on.
Yeah, Europe is tearing itself apart on the Somme and on the Eastern Front and so on. South America hosts the first version of the Copa America. And it's held annually in the early stages, and it leads to a rapid rise in standards. So much so that 1924, the Paris Olympics, the football tournament becomes the biggest thing. It kind of outgrows the Olympic Games because of Uruguay, who'd won that first Copa America in 1916, won a few others as well, came over to Paris for the Olympics, unheralded, unheard of. Who is this little country? Wiped the floor with everyone, playing a style of football that, and if you read the contemporary accounts, everything that subsequent generations have said about Brazil 70, at the time they said about Uruguay 24. And this lit a fire for football. It was obvious, remember the Olympics is only open to amateurs, the English are professionals. It was obvious here that we needed a tournament open to everyone. Who is the best? And really the question in 24 is, are these Uruguayans really better than English professionals? We need a World Cup to find out. 28, there's another Olympics in Amsterdam. Argentina also come over. The final is Uruguay against Argentina, proving that 24 is no fluke. Uruguay win that one as well. And they agreed to organise the first World Cup in 1930. So it really is a South American story. You take away the South American contribution and the World Cup doesn't get going until mid-50s. A little bit like, you know, Copa America started in 16, the Euro started in 56 or something, you know. And had the World Cup just been left to the Europeans, it would have been the same. So the South American contribution to the World Cup is huge. But it's not just a history book, far from it. Remember, the reigning world champions at the time we're speaking are South American. The team who've won this trophy more times than anyone else is South American. And I think it means more to South America than anywhere else. If I could claim Panama for the cause, I know Panama is Central America, but it used to be South America, it used to be part of Colombia until the Americans decided we want to build a canal there, and they managed to separate it. When Panama played Belgium in the World Cup, it was their first World Cup game. In
England's group, yeah.
Yes, in Russia in 2018. There were more supporters from Panama in the stadium than there were supporters from Belgium. And, you know, recent World Cups, I mean, the Peruvians in Russia 2018, the Colombians invading everywhere. You know, it means so much to South American nationhoods. So it's a history, but as a wiser man than myself once said, history isn't past. You know, it's still living to this day.
And I suppose it's football the way that, you know, South America, I don't want to say it's marginal, but it's not. When you look at the front of the newspaper, it doesn't necessarily, particularly outside of Brazil or Argentina, but countries like Peru, Colombia, Uruguay, whereas in football they're on the world stage. They're the summit of the biggest. Yeah.
I think there's two moments. There's the South Cone, where it catches on quickest, and they're the countries that have won the World Cup: Uruguay, Brazil, and Argentina. And when they play, there's all of that burden of history and tradition. Sometimes that's too much. 2014 with Brazil is a case in point. What they're saying through the World Cup is, we are winners. You are jealous of us. What the other nations, what a nation like Ecuador or Paraguay, who returned to the World Cup this year for the first time since 2010, what they're saying when they line up for their World Cup games is, we exist. Both are very, very powerful statements.
Because it wasn't outside of Europe and South America, it was pretty recently that you got big numbers from Africa and Asia. Is that true?
Yes.
So 80s,
yes.
90s?
Yes. When the '66 World Cup, and the '66 World Cup is an important moment because it's the moment where there's only one place for Asia and Africa together.
Right.
And the English president of FIFA, his big cause is the defence of apartheid South Africa. So a lot of the Africans boycott it in the first place. So there's this discontent from Asia and Africa, and the South Americans come away from the '66 World Cup thinking we've been stitched up.
Because there's more African to know.
No, because Europe has stitched them up.
Right.
That Pele gets kicked out of the competition, and the referees are crap. The referees are dismal. And the president of FIFA, the English president of FIFA, he's supposed to be a refereeing specialist. You know, that goal, the third goal for England against Germany, is an eloquent symbol of how terrible the referees were in that World Cup. And they're all European, with very, very few exceptions. I think of all the knockout matches.
The Azerbaijani linesman.
Yes, yeah. Pele gets kicked out. Argentina have their captain mysteriously sent off by a German referee. The same day, Uruguay against Germany, an English referee sends off two Uruguayans. So the South Americans come away from this thinking, we've been stitched up. And they start thinking of themselves less as European, because most of the movers and shakers, they're still quite strong European roots. They're recent European colonialists, really. And they start thinking of themselves a little bit more of maybe third world. You know, it's third worldism is in vogue in the 60s. So that's the block that Havelange forms in '74, which enables him to unseat Stanley Rouse, and with a block of South America, but South America's only got 10 countries, you know, and it needs to form an alliance with Africa and Asia in order to be powerful. The victory of Havelange in '74 just sends football off in a new direction with negatives and positives. You know, it means far more places in the World Cup for the developing world, which I think is a positive thing, even if it leads to a very unwieldy tournament. So there's loads of geopolitics in this as well.
It's interesting what you're saying about so for example, say you're a Brazilian in the 60s, it's quite likely that your father or grandfather came from Europe, and there's direct memory of that, whereas now it's too far back. There's no sense of being Spanish or Italian or Portuguese.
Very little. I mean, Brazilian fascism, non-militaristic, but with a strong Mussolini influence, used radio a lot in the 1930s. The 1930s and the 40s are key decades for kind of nation building of Brazil, and the Maracanã Stadium is almost like a symbol of that. You know, they built the Maracanã Stadium for the first World Cup, and it's in the expectation that they're going to win it.
Yeah,
it's very much like the English building Nelson's Column before the Battle of Trafalgar. You know, and there's so much hubris with the Maracanã. It's got to be bigger than Hampden Park.
Right.
Got to be bigger than Hampden Park.
Yeah.
Got to have a bigger capacity. And you've been there recently, you know. Even now, it's awe-inspiring. What it must have looked like in 1950, this giant spaceship parked close to the city centre.
Yeah, it did feel a bit sort of FIFA-fied, if that's a word.
Inside.
Yeah,
yes.
The outside was incredible,
Yeah.
and the sort of, you feel like you're just in the concrete hull, like a ship. But inside, do people feel they've got something there?
Yes, no doubt about it. And it used to be a free-for-all.
It's very much not a free-for-all.
It's very much not a free-for-all, yeah.
And one thing that kind of struck me speaking to you and others in Brazil was that there's a lot of sort of misery and tragedy wrapped up there that not tragedy, but that we've lost and these terrible defeats. And I just think you're the best country in the world, Brazil. You've won it 5 times. You won it really recently, 94, 2002. But the sort of defeats seem to loom larger.
They do, yeah. Even academic tracts tend to talk about World Cups that Brazil lost and World Cups that Brazil won, as if it's heads or tails. And all right, they've won it 5 times, but the vast majority of times they lose,
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's 2002 is touching on history for 24 years ago.
That's it.
Proper adults walking around.
That's it. Who've never seen it. No. Yeah, and it's
a lot of the squad.
It's a birthright. Yeah. Exactly.
Is that birthright fading? Do Brazil go into World Cups with any less expectation?
Yeah, and also.
And in 2002, European football was a hell of a lot less powerful and rich in comparison.
Also, you get the factor that so many of the players now, the best players, are usually playing abroad. So there's a distance there as well. The Club World Cup was just giant. It was just massive, because they are the teams and the players that they're watching every week. So there's a stronger connection than there is with the national team. And the Club World Cup was like the national team playing 4 times in 3 days. It was madness.
To go back to the book, is there anything that you learned that you didn't know before?
Lots, and that's the joy of it. We got a lot of World Cups to go through, so it has to be quite punchy. It would be kind of nice from a writing point of view to dedicate a whole book to one World Cup, and then you'd really have to dig. So it has to be light and breezy, because there's only so much space for so much history, but so many things. I mean, my favourite. It's a bit obscure, this one, but it's a favourite of mine.
I like obscure. Obscure's good.
You're too young to remember It's a Knockout.
I've heard of it.
With the now disgraced Stuart Hall and Uncle Arthur with his dipstick, who would measure how well teams had done in these ridiculous games that were played. Now, Uncle Arthur was Arthur Ellis, and he was a very famous referee. He was
I've heard that name.
He was a bluff, no nonsense North Country referee, and he handled Brazil against Hungary quarter-final in 1954 in Switzerland, and Hungary won. And Brazil launched a formal complaint that the referee had blown his whistle in service of godless communism. Uncle Arthur, the avuncular Uncle Arthur, and he'd given a penalty against Brazil. And so many accounts would say it was no penalty, and people invaded the field. Some of the Brazilian delegation, including a former referee, kind of invaded the field to protest. And I managed to find on good quality film the moment of the handball.
Wow!
I found it.
And it was a handball.
Yeah, it was a handball. And you see, inadvertently, without wanting to, on the centre backs, he slips and he puts his hand down and he touches the ball, and you see the referee, as he points, mimicking the exact gesture. So, to be able to say definitively, yes, I've exonerated Uncle Arthur.
Wow, okay.
I've cleared him now of all charges of blowing his whistle in favour of godless communism.
It must be a big change between older World Cups and now, that there was a bit of mystery, whether it was handball or not, whether it was a foul or not.
Yeah,
whereas now there's 100 different camera angles.
Yes. Yeah, although there are still stories to be told. And part of those stories are the hinterland.
Suarez.
Yeah, on the hinterland. For example, this is something which has been forgotten even in Brazil for very obvious reasons. Going into the 1970 World Cup, there was quite a powerful lobby, including the fellow who'd been a coach when they won in '62, saying, Pelé passed it.
Right.
We shouldn't take him. He's a passenger. What are we doing carrying Pelé? And obviously,
deleted from the record.
Yeah, that's been erased. So being able to revisit that, I think, is interesting. And even from Argentina, because again, this story I don't think is particularly well known. The reigning world champions, Scaloni, the coach, never coached a senior side in his life. He gets a job because he's there. He'd been on the coaching staff in Russia, which was a disaster, observing future opponents of Argentina. And they had Sampaoli on a long-term contract. He'd been awful, so they sacked him. So they didn't have any money. Scaloni's there. He's cheap.
The cheap.
Yeah, well, put him there. And Scaloni, he's been obsessed with France in the World Cup in 18. And he said, what we want to do now, the style that we want to implant, is quick transitions. I want to win the ball, and within 3 or 4 seconds I want to be in a position to shoot. And you're thinking, well, that's an idea of play. There's not really any space for Lionel Messi. You know, how's that going to work? And I remember Maradona at the time saying, well, Scaloni, he's a nice enough lad, but he's not fit to direct traffic, you know, let alone run the national team.
Well, Maradona's stint was pretty disastrous, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, he did get him qualifying, but he went mad during the World Cup.
Yeah.
And then it was hard to disagree with him. It was hard to disagree with what Maradona was saying. And Scaloni's first tournament was Copa America of 2019. They tried this idea of, and it was just awful. I remember the first game they got beat by Colombia. They were terrible. During that tournament, they started to inch towards something better. And this is key, Messi was on board in a way that he'd never, ever been on board before. He decided, he was falling out with Barcelona, he decided that the priority of his career now is going to be the national team. And where his kind of self-contained, introverted nature had intimidated the other players, suddenly he became the vocal leader. So he
became a bit sort of aggro, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. Yeah. He even picked up a suspension at the end of that tournament for talking too much. You know, for talking out of line.
Was his tattoos a late addition?
I think so.
He looked a lot more macho, didn't he?
And so he suddenly becomes Mr.
Being the sort of slightly effete sort of posh boy, or not posh boy. He was more middle class than others, wasn't he?
Yeah. So all of that story, I think, you know, there's a backstory. So even the teams that people will remember very well, there's a backstory to them that I think is stories that have very seldom been told, and probably never in English.
And did you find, doing your research, any common threads among teams that win the World Cup? I mean, there's obviously people talk about growing into the tournament, things like that. Teams that, you know, do they tend to start as favourites? Do they tend to? Is it common for a team to really grow into it?
It's certainly said in Brazil that in order to win the World Cup, they've got to be booed first,
right?
By their own fans.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's happened most times. When in 70 they won all of their qualifiers, they were 100%, but things were going wrong. They lost to Argentina in the build-up, and the coach that they had, and that's a fascinating story because at the height of the military dictatorship, Brazil's coach during qualification was a communist. It's an extraordinary story, and we explain why in the book. So maybe that's a common thread. It also works a little bit with Argentina. Because, you know, Argentina going into '86 were a shambles, and there were lots of things going on behind the scenes as well. And in '78 they lost the first game and had to dig themselves out of.
And again in 2022.
Indeed, yeah. So maybe. And quite often, there's an expression in Brazil about teams that think too much of themselves. That they're wearing high heels.
Right.
And those times when 2006 is an obvious example. You know, our man there behind us, Ronaldo. You know, that front four, Ronaldo, Adriano, Kaká and Ronaldinho.
So I feel like trying to fit all the best players into a team regardless of formation.
It was just assumed that we're going to win. And I never thought they had the slightest chance of winning, you know. But
that was a funny one because were Italy the best team in the world at that point?
No,
the best keeper
not.
And the best central defender, but
probably
attacking
not.
players not at all. Yeah.
No. I think Argentina probably were.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they had a terrific team. I think they were better than Germany. They left Messi on the bench. You know, you leave Messi on the bench when you're defending a 1-0 lead. Someone who can just keep the ball tied to his little left foot and wander around and frustrate the Germans.
Do you think that the best teams usually win World Cups?
No, I think quite often they don't. No. It's obviously the team that peaks at the right time.
And gets lucky with a draw.
Yes, and I mean,
but 1 millimetre, you know, in a league season, the best team generally does win.
Exactly. But that's part of the charm of a cup, isn't it? That little bit of unpredictability.
So outside Brazil and Argentina and I suppose Uruguay teams winning World Cups, are there any particularly fun stories that jump out from?
Well, Colombia is always a fun story because Colombia, in populational terms, Colombia is the biggest country in South America with the exception of Brazil. So it's the biggest country.
Bigger than Argentina?
Yeah. And it has many more urban centres, which is, on football, is a game of the city. So Colombia is always a team that you're thinking, you know, outside of the three that have won it, the one that could one day is Colombia. And you know, the story of Colombia in '94 is an incredible story. It's an unbelievable story.
For the benefit of people watching,
well, it's a time when Colombia had become La Colombia, the crazy country when the drug cartels were absolutely running amok. The team was receiving death threats since even before Italia 90, and it keeps on getting ramped up and ramped up and ramped up and ramped up, and it ends with the tragedy of Andres Escobar, who was a very, very cultured centre-back, scored a goal at Wembley the day that Colombia came of age, a 1-1 draw against England in '88. He scored the goal. So the story of that Colombia side, you can be told between two Escobar goals. There's one that he scores that gets him a draw against Wembley in '88, and there's one that he scores in the wrong net when they lose to the States in USA '94. And from being one of the early favourites, they become the first team that's eliminated, and he gets assassinated straight after. On the plane back, he's sitting next to Asprilla, and he says, because he was a bright lad, Escobar, he was looked up to, well educated.
I've seen the statue in a Medellin Park that it says Caballero, the gentleman of football.
Gentleman, yes, and Escobar is saying to Asprilla, look, I know you like going out. It's probably best to lie low for a little while.
Right.
You know, and tragically, he doesn't take his own advice.
I'm just thinking, has every country qualified?
Venezuela haven't.
Haven't.
It's the one that Venezuela is part of the baseball belt, really.
Right.
Remember,
the Caribbean.
Hugo Chavez joined the army to play baseball.
Yep.
You know, football, it's always been there, but it's more historically related to immigrant communities of Portuguese and Italians and so on. So it's a much newer thing, but they're going to make it one day. They will make it. They've made huge strides.
And when you get into Suriname, Guyana, but are they?
That's Central America. I know geographically it's but culturally it's part of Central America.
And what is that cultural difference between Central and South America?
I've never been there, but part of it is linguistics. You know,
interesting. But they speak Spanish.
Guyana is English.
Right. Yeah.
There's a French Guyana, which is French. Suriname is Dutch.
Okay.
So it's
So when you get to sort of Belize and Costa Rica, and why would they?
Because that is Central America.
Yeah.
That's much higher up. That's up the other side of Panama.
But sort of politically, you think of Latin America as stretching from the
and
American border down to Tierra del Fuego.
Yeah,
but in football terms, it doesn't.
It doesn't. No. And Latin America, I think, is a bit of a French construction.
French.
Yeah.
Why?
It was the French.
Okay.
During the mid-19th, when they're trying to, the term Latin America, there's a commonality between the French and all of these countries.
Right, and there's not French at all.
So it was an idea of I think it was part of French foreign policy. Certainly our book has nothing to do with Latin America. It's South America. Because in footballing terms, they are totally different traditions.
Yeah. Because Mexico the teams played in the Copa Libertadores for a while.
They did for a while, and the future of the Libertadores will, I think, inevitably include it will include Mexico and the United States.
Yeah, that's a long flight from Buenos Aires.
It's a long way. Yeah. The distance between Buenos Aires and Mexico City is further than that between London and a number of cities in India.
Right.
So the Americas are massive.
And we all know how important football is in South America, but the World Cup specifically.
Yeah.
Is just completely massive, the biggest thing.
It's something that I love. It's beginning to lose some of its intensity, which I regret. But there's a habit in Brazil of decorating the streets for the World Cup. Banners and street murals and so on. And I think this is fab. I think this is fabulous because some don't like it. They see this as an exercise in alienation. But what are they celebrating?
Yeah.
They're celebrating themselves.
Yeah.
This isn't a nationalism of the great and the famous, of Lord Nelson or something like that. This is, Gabriel Jesus, in 2014, he's a kid out decorating his streets.
Right.
And in 2018, which is probably the turning point of his career, because he's Brazil's centre forward and he doesn't score a goal. And I don't think he's ever recovered from that.
Really
He hasn't really wanted to be centre forward ever since. He's tried to run away from the responsibility of being the goal scorer. But this idea of the streets being decorated, I think is such a strong celebration of themselves, and I think that's really, really valid.
It's a bit of a cliche that the football unifies people, but in these countries like Brazil and Argentina that are so complicated and disparate, does the World Cup provide a unifying force? And then it all goes belly up when they lose.
Yes, but I mean, I'm always conscious of the limitations of this.
Yeah.
I prefer to see it, I think, as Well, there's the phrase from, it's a US sociologist, Janet Lever, wrote a book called Soccer Fever many years ago, and she would refer to Brazilian football specifically, although I think you can do it wider to South America, as a living register of society's potential, and I think that works.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think that I've found some solace in those trees dying for our book is, the Epstein file stuff.
Oh, yeah.
That was. This is a stretch, but I'll promise you, I can just about make it relevant. And all of the kind of sex trafficking stuff, we all knew. We all knew. What I think, looking at some of the stuff, what came as a real shock is the extent to which that class see themselves as a master race. They really do. Really do. And it's these techno nerds, they see themselves as a master race.
Not in football.
Well, and football is such a great counter-argument to that, And he was born 52 years after Brazil abolishes enslavement, in a poor family. He's a shoe-shine boy.
Yeah.
Edson Orantes do Nascimento. And yet,
conquered the world.
Yeah.
Black man when,
Yeah, and makes, I think, more than anyone else, transforms the World Cup into the event that stops the planet every 4 years, but everyone watches it.
Which it still is.
It's a similar story with Maradona, So and football reminds us again and again and again, if you give opportunities to people, look where that talent does come from. And so I think it's a really important counter-argument to the Epstein files. I really do.
No, I like it a lot. Yeah.
I really do, because these ideas are becoming increasingly lunatic, of a kind of hand-picked master race, And look where the talent comes from. If you take away the barriers to competition, and the elite love putting barriers to competition, and then saying we're the elite. Of course you fucking are. You put the barriers there, And this is our story. Why are Uruguay so prominent? Because right from the start, Uruguay has the first welfare state, and Uruguay is able to draw on talent right from the start from all sectors of their society, including poor, including black. The very first Copa America, very first game, Uruguay against Chile. Chile launched a protest saying that Uruguay are fielding black professionals, African professionals, because they've got a couple of black players in there, 1924, when they win the Olympics, it's the first, Andrade, it's the first black superstar. So that's how Uruguay were able to punch so much above their weight. So this is a lesson that football teaches us again and again and again. You give opportunities, you take away the barriers to competition, because football does that as the nature of the game. It's such a simple game. You don't need expensive equipment in order to do it. Take away those barriers, and the talent flourishes where it is. And I think spreading that message over the history of the World Cup is probably a reasonable trade-off for a couple of trees.
Great, Tim Vickery. Let's leave it there. Tell me once again, name of the book, your co-author, where people can buy it. Yeah, the book is called Mundiales, which is Spanish for World Cups. It is written by myself and the Northern academic Mark Birham, and it's available from all fine bookshops and from the Pitch Publishing website. Yeah.